Have you ever wondered why your silence unsettles people? Why your presence feels like a question mark in rooms built for performance? There was a time not long ago when you believed being thoughtful, kind, and deep would make you more lovable. You listened more than you spoke. You questioned what others blindly accepted. You weren't trying to be different, you just were. But the more you saw, the more you felt out of place. At first, you tried to shrink it, your insight, your intensity, your questions. You toned yourself down in relationships, laughed at things that weren't funny, nodded at ideas you didn't believe in. You performed. You tried to fit in. But deep down, you knew something felt off, like you were betraying a part of yourself just to be chosen. Then came the shift. Maybe it was heartbreak. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the quiet ache of not recognizing yourself anymore. But one day you stopped chasing approval. You stopped apologizing for your clarity. You started waking up, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't seek attention, but truth. And that changed everything. Why does your depth make others so uncomfortable? It's not your words that unsettle them. It's your silence. It's not that you're cold, it's that you're clear. Most people are used to emotional noise, small talk, empty validation, predictable reactions. You, on the other hand, walk into a room and see. You don't scan for approval. You observe. You don't chase conversation. You wait for something real. And that stillness, that discernment begins to expose what others try to hide. It makes people uneasy, especially in a culture where comfort is mistaken for connection. From a young age, you probably felt out of place, while others were rewarded for fitting in, for smiling, on command for echoing the loudest voice in the room you were busy watching. Thinking, feeling things too deeply. You may have even been told you were too intense, too quiet, or too serious. But what they were really saying was, you can't be controlled. Because you didn't respond the way they expected. You didn't perform for applause. You didn't flatter to be liked. And in a world built on emotional choreography, that kind of authenticity is dangerous. You are not misunderstood because you lack empathy. You're misunderstood because you refuse to betray yourself to gain approval. You don't nod at lies just to be polite. You don't join the crowd just to feel safe. Your presence is a mirror, and most people hate mirrors that don't flatter them. You don't give people the version of yourself that makes them feel better, you give them the truth. Not to hurt, but because you can't pretend. And that truth, it burns. This is why intelligent men are so often mislabeled. They're called distant when they're actually discerning, arrogant when they're simply self-possessed, cold when they're just composed. And yet, beneath all these labels is a man who simply refuses to shrink. A man who would rather walk alone than live a lie. What you carry, this depth, this clarity, is not a weakness. It's not something to hide. It is your edge. It is the fire that purifies. And yes, it will cost you. You may be misread. You may be rejected. But understand this. The discomfort you cause is often the discomfort of truth, entering a room that's grown too used to illusion. And that is not a flaw. That is power. Modern relationships are no longer built on truth. They are built on performance. You've felt this, haven't you? That subtle pressure to be charming, agreeable, interesting, emotionally available on cue, but not too much. Say the right things, text back at the right time, show just enough vulnerability to seem human, but not enough to be seen. It's a game of optics. And in that game, presence, true-rooted, unwavering presence, is not welcomed. It's unsettling. It's too raw, too honest. So you learn to play. You learn to smile when you're tired, flirt when you're uninterested, care when you're numb. You give affection that's expected, not always felt. You withhold the harder truths because you know most people aren't ready for them. And in that act, you lose something. Not your ability to love, but your ability to be real while loving. Because you've realized that many don't want you. They want the version of you that fits their fantasy. But the intelligent man, the awake man, can't fake that fantasy forever. He sees the script. He notices the emotional transactions. I give you praise, you give me attention. I play wounded, you play savior. And something in him recoils, not out of arrogance, but from the painful recognition that this isn't intimacy. It's theater. He doesn't want to rehearse roles. He wants revelation. He doesn't want to be desired for what he represents, protector, provider, project. He wants to be met fully, honestly, soul to soul. But in a world that confuses attention with affection and manipulation with connection, his presence feels like a glitch in the system. Because he doesn't chase, he doesn't flatter, he doesn't seduce through illusion, he just is. And that kind of being clear, unedited, unperformed, is terrifying to those who only know how to love through roles. You've seen it, haven't you? The moment you stopped performing, people called you distant. The moment you stopped chasing, they accused you of being cold. But they weren't reacting to absence. They were reacting to presence without performance. A presence that asked, "Can you love me without the act?" And most couldn't. Because they weren't seeking truth. They were seeking a reflection of themselves. And when they couldn't mold you into that, they left. But you didn't lose them. You lost the role. And that, brother, is liberation. No one warns you that awakening will cost you your comfort. That the moment you stop performing for love, for validation, for belonging, you'll start losing people. You'll feel it first in the silence. Fewer messages, fewer invitations. A growing distance between you and the world you use to bend yourself to fit. But this isn't punishment, it's proof. Proof that the path to becoming whole is paved with solitude. The truth is, most people aren't ready for a man who's done pretending. They're drawn to the illusion of depth, not the weight of it. They crave connection, but only if it doesn't demand their own self-reflection. When you begin to live in alignment, to say what you mean, to stop apologizing for your clarity, to no longer dim your fire for someone else's comfort, you become something they can no longer control. And so, they leave. It hurts. Not because you need them, but because you once thought they saw you. But what they saw was a version of you shaped by their comfort. The real you, the one who doesn't chase, doesn't entertain superficiality, doesn't play roles. That version demands honesty. And honesty is expensive in a world built on pretense. So you walk alone. At first, that solitude feels like exile, like you've been cast out of a world you used to belong to. But as the silence deepens, something else begins to rise: clarity. The noise fades. The masks fall away. You stop confusing attention with affection, drama, with love, entertainment, with connection. You begin to see how often you betrayed yourself just to be accepted. And that seeing, as painful as it is, becomes sacred. You start to realize this solitude isn't a void. It's a sanctuary, a proving ground, a forge. Here you meet yourself again, not the version you presented to be liked, but the one who watches, who questions, who refuses to lie to himself. The one who would rather be alone in truth than surrounded in illusion. This is the price of awakening, to feel misunderstood, misread, even feared, not because you are broken, but because you've stopped pretending. And those still pretending will call your presence a threat. But brother, let them call it what they will. Because the man who learns to walk alone no longer walks in circles. He walks forward, toward wholeness, toward peace, and toward the life that only truth can build. You are not feared because you are violent. You are feared because you are unconditioned. There's a quiet kind of power that comes from a man who cannot be manipulated, a man who has untangled himself from the emotional strings society uses to control. That man doesn't explode. He doesn't shout to be heard. He doesn't react just to gain favor or approval. He simply does not play the game. And in a world built on systems that thrive on compliance and emotional predictability, that is terrifying. You've probably felt it the way people try to read. You label you, contain you. When you're too quiet, they call you cold. When you don't engage in small talk or drama, they say you're distant. When you don't chase, they say you're arrogant. But what they're really saying is we don't know what to do with someone we can't control. Because your refusal to be predictable disrupts the emotional ecosystem they depend on. Most social systems, from schools to corporate structures to modern dating, aren't designed for truth. They're designed for role scripts, emotional obedience. And once you've awakened to that, you start seeing the mechanisms everywhere, the way charm is rewarded over clarity, performance, over principle, reaction, over reflection. You watch as people get praised not for who they are, but for how well they adapt to the expectations placed on them. But you stopped adapting. You stopped lowering your standards to make others comfortable. You stopped pretending to be nice when what was really required was honesty. And in doing so, you crossed a line. You became sovereign. And sovereignty in a world built on soft control is the greatest threat there is. You can't be baited. You don't overreact. You're no longer addicted to being liked. You don't move just because someone pulls an emotional lever. You choose, deliberately, consciously. And that level of autonomy is unsettling to those who have built their entire identity on being emotionally reactive. So yes, the world fears the unconditioned man. Not because he is cruel, but because he is clear. Not because he dominates, but because he refuses to be dominated. He is a mirror that reflects the weakness of systems, the emptiness of expectations, and the lie that says a man's worth is measured by how well he conforms. And that reflection, it breaks the illusion. It's not intelligence that frightens them. It's what your intelligence reveals. Women and people in general are not afraid of smart men. They're afraid of men who see too much. Men who don't flatter, who don't follow the script, who don't need to be liked in order to feel whole. They're afraid of the man who listens more than he talks. The man who doesn't chase validation because he already has clarity. The man who doesn't get drawn into emotional chaos because he recognizes it for what it is, a performance. You've seen it, haven't you? The moment you stopped playing along, stopped reassuring, stopped begging, stopped adjusting yourself to be more palatable, the connection began to fracture. Not because you changed, but because you refused to be predictable. And in a world where emotional predictability is mistaken for trust, the man who won't be emotionally pulled like a puppet is seen as unsafe. But you are not unsafe. You are simply whole. And wholeness, especially in a man, is foreign. Because so many people are taught to love through control, not through connection. They want a man who responds exactly how they expect. A man who says the right thing at the right time, who chases when they pull away, who explains himself when they project, who makes them feel powerful even when they're being emotionally dishonest. But the intelligent man doesn't do that. He doesn't run in circles. He doesn't chase shadows. He watches. He discerns. And that discernment, it's terrifying. Because it means they can't manipulate you. It means you won't be swayed by tears that aren't rooted in truth. It means you won't play the role of savior, fixer, or fool. You won't dance for attention. You won't compromise your peace just to feel desired. They fear you not because you're hard to love, but because you require real love to be reached. Love that is honest. Love that is mature. Love that is mutual. And in a culture flooded with shallow attention and unresolved trauma, that kind of love is rare. You don't demand to be worshipped. You don't need to be chosen. You need to be met, soul to soul, without illusions, without games. And that demand, silent, steady, unwavering, is what makes you so feared. Because it cannot be faked. It can only be matched. Most men are not in pain because they lack love. They're in pain because they've abandoned themselves to be loved. Somewhere along the way, you were taught subtly, persistently, that being accepted was more important than being honest. So you adjusted. You softened your words. You bit your tongue when something felt wrong. You learned to smile when you were uneasy, to perform humility when what you really needed was strength. You began to live not as who you are, but as who you were trained to be. But that betrayal, quiet, consistent, invisible to others, started to grow inside of you. At first, it felt like restlessness, then numbness, then a kind of quiet despair, not loud, not catastrophic, just a slow fading of your essence. Like you were still moving through life, still doing what was expected, but your soul was somewhere else, watching, waiting, wondering if you would ever return. This is what Søren Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death, not the death of the body, but the death of the self. A despair so profound you don't even know it's there because you've become used to it. You've learned to normalize it, to call it maturity, to call it being realistic. But beneath those labels is a man suffocating under the weight of his own unspoken truth. And the most tragic part, you were never told this was happening. No one warned you that losing yourself could happen so quietly, that you could smile in public and still be dying inside, that you could be praised for being easygoing while slowly becoming invisible to your own spirit. But one day, the pain becomes too loud to ignore. One day, you look in the mirror and realize you no longer recognize the man staring back. And in that moment, sharp, terrifying, holy, you face the truth. You've betrayed yourself in order to be loved by a world that only loved your obedience. And that's when everything begins to change. Because once you see the cost of your own silence, you can't pretend anymore. You stop apologizing for your clarity. You stop minimizing your voice. You stop dimming your fire. And yes, it will cost you comfort, familiarity, maybe even connection. But it will give you back the one thing that truly matters: yourself. Not the role, not the performance. The man you were always meant to be. The intelligent man suffers not because he is weak, but because he sees too clearly. Clarity is a strange kind of curse in a world addicted to illusion. You begin to notice things others don't. The hidden motives in someone's compliments, the unspoken resentment behind their affection, the disconnect between what's said and what's felt. You see the cracks in the smiles, the neediness behind the flirting, the manipulation behind what others call love. And once you see, you cannot unsee. You may have thought at first that your insights would bring you closer to others, that your ability to read between the lines would foster intimacy. But instead, it often creates distance. Because when people realize they can't fool you, not with charm, not with performance, not with emotional theatrics, they feel exposed. And most people don't want to be seen. They want to be celebrated for the mask they wear. But the intelligent man doesn't celebrate masks. He questions them. Gently, sometimes silently, but always with precision. His presence becomes a mirror. And not the kind that flatters, the kind that reflects truth. This is why people label him as intimidating or judgmental, not because he condemns, but because his very presence invites honesty. And honesty is uncomfortable when you've built your relationships on illusion. This ability to see through the fog, to cut through the noise, doesn't make life easier. In fact, it often makes it lonelier. You ruin conversations with inconvenient truths. You ruin first dates with honest questions. You ruin group dynamics by refusing to laugh at things that aren't funny. But deep down, you're not trying to ruin anything. You're simply trying to stay awake, to stay real in a world that rewards sleepwalking. You realize that what most people call chemistry is unresolved trauma. That what they call romance is often control in disguise. That what they call confidence is really insecurity hiding behind a polished exterior. You don't judge them for it, you just can't pretend not to notice. And that noticing isolates you. But here's the truth: seeing clearly is not a flaw, it's a responsibility. You are not here to play along. You are here to wake up, and in doing so, awaken others, even if they resist it, even if they reject you for it. Because the man who sees through illusions does not chase comfort. He follows truth wherever it leads. Most people don't want love. They want a performance. They want someone who makes them feel special without ever challenging their illusions. Someone who flatters their insecurities, mirrors their expectations, and plays the role they've assigned without ever going off script. But the intelligent man, the awakened man, cannot perform love. He can only embody it. And that embodiment is rooted not in charm, but in alignment. You've learned the hard way that showing up fully without pretenses, without emotional choreography, often makes others retreat. Not because you're wrong, but because your presence demands presence in return. And most people aren't ready for that. They want emotional highs. They want chemistry laced with chaos. They want desire wrapped in illusion. But you offer something else, something rarer, quieter, more enduring truth. For you, love isn't a game. It isn't seduction or possession. It isn't a test of worth or a trade of roles. It's a meeting, soul to soul, without manipulation, without masks. It's not about being chosen because you're convenient or impressive. It's about being seen and accepted for who you are when no one's watching. That kind of love requires more than attraction. It requires alignment. And alignment means you refuse to contort yourself just to keep someone comfortable. You don't become softer to seem less intimidating. You don't shrink your silence to fill awkward space. You don't fake vulnerability to appear more lovable. You simply bring your whole self calm, present, unapologetically honest. And because of that, many won't stay. You'll be called distant because you won't chase. Cold because you won't perform. Arrogant because you won't beg. But you're not any of those things. You're clear. You've outgrown relationships where love must be earned by self-betrayal. You no longer confuse approval with affection. You don't need someone to validate you. You need someone who recognizes you, who has done the inner work to meet you where you are. So you wait, not in bitterness, not in desperation, in stillness, in strength, in trust, because you know the love you're looking for cannot be found in people who need you to play small. It can only be found in those who have walked through their own fire and emerged whole. Love for you is no longer about being desired. It's about being aligned in truth, in depth, in presence. And that changes everything. In a world addicted to noise, silence becomes rebellion. We live in a time where value is measured by visibility. Everyone is speaking, posting, reacting, reaching louder, faster, more often. We confuse noise with relevant stimulation with meaning. But the intelligent man has always known better. He doesn't speak just to fill space. He doesn't move just to be noticed. He doesn't chase connection just to feel less alone. He waits. He observes. He watches, and in that stillness, he becomes powerful. There's something deeply unsettling about a man who doesn't need to be the center of attention. A man who can enter a room and simply be. No need to perform, no need to charm, no need to compete for approval. He doesn't interrupt, he doesn't impose. But his presence shifts the room not because he's trying to dominate it, but because he isn't trying at all. He just is, rooted, calm, unmoved. People mistake his silence for disinterest, but they don't understand that still waters are the deepest, that the man who listens more than he speaks is not withholding, he's discerning, that his quiet isn't emptiness, it's intention. He is measuring truth. He is watching behavior. He is tracking the energy beneath the words. And most people can't handle that kind of presence, because when someone is fully present, they force others to confront how distracted they are. When someone holds silence with confidence, it exposes how uncomfortable others are in their own skin. When someone no longer seeks validation, it reveals how deeply others still depend on it. That's why the intelligent man's strength isn't in his volume but in his restraint. He doesn't overshare. He doesn't rush to explain. He doesn't apologize for needing time-space solitude. He doesn't fear being misunderstood because he no longer needs to be understood by everyone. He has outgrown the need to be decoded. He is no longer trying to be accessible to those committed to misunderstanding him. And in that quiet confidence, he becomes untouchable. Not unreachable, just rare. Not arrogant, just anchored. Not cold, just clear. His solitude isn't exile. It's a sanctuary. His stillness isn't weakness. It's a signal of power. And his silence. That's the loudest truth he's ever spoken. Not every man is called to walk alone, but the one who knows it deep in his bones. He doesn't choose solitude because he enjoys pain. He chooses it because truth has demanded it. Because somewhere along the journey he realized that to remain authentic, he would have to leave the crowd behind. Not out of pride, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Because the roles offered to him, lover-protector, performer-provider, began to feel like cages. And so, he broke free. Søren Kierkegaard called him the Knight of Faith, a man who lives inwardly before he lives outwardly, who doesn't follow the path laid out by culture, but carves his own guided not by applause, but by conviction. He doesn't look successful in the way the world defines success. He may be overlooked, misunderstood, even mocked. But inside him burns a quiet fire, a devotion to something deeper, truer, unshakable. He has given up the safety of being liked. He has surrendered the ease of fitting in. He has embraced the storm of self-inquiry, of relentless honesty. And now he walks with clarity, not because he has all the answers, but because he's no longer afraid of the questions. You can feel this man when he enters the room, not because he demands attention, but because his energy is different. It doesn't reach outward, it anchors inward. He's not selling you a version of himself. He's not performing. He's not negotiating his values to win approval. He is aligned. And alignment is rare. It makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to confront how far they've strayed from themselves. This man doesn't walk alone because no one wants him. He walks alone because so few can meet him. He no longer needs to be needed. He no longer mistakes validation for love. He is not moved by trends, by gossip, by shallow praise. His compass points to something eternal, call it God, truth, purpose, soul. And yes, it's a lonely path, but it's also sacred, because the man who walks alone with intention, with integrity, with unwavering devotion to his truth, becomes more than a man. He becomes a force, a signal, a reminder to others of what still lives beneath the noise. Not all will understand him, but the few who do will never forget him. There is a certain kind of freedom that doesn't come wrapped in success applause or recognition. It comes wrapped in solitude, in loss, in quiet self-confrontation. And it doesn't arrive gently. It arrives like a storm that tears down everything you once called your identity. But when the dust settles, what remains is real. This is the power most men never reach, not because they're incapable, but because they've been conditioned to avoid the pain that awakens it. They've been trained to confuse comfort with peace, performance with purpose. And in doing so, they sacrifice their edge, their clarity, their soul, all to remain digestible to the world around them. But you, if you've come this far, you've already felt it. That ache, that subtle betrayal of self every time you say yes when you mean no. Every time you laugh when something feels hollow. Every time you chase affection that requires you to become someone else. Eventually, the pain of that betrayal becomes louder than the fear of walking away. And when you finally do, when you stop apologizing for your depth, your questions, your presence, you don't just reclaim your identity, you reclaim your power. But not power as the world defines it, not domination, not control, not manipulation. You discover something far more dangerous: sovereignty. The man who no longer needs to be liked becomes free. The man who no longer performs becomes untouchable. And the man who no longer explains himself to those committed to misunderstanding him becomes dangerous, because he is now aligned not with the world's expectations, but with his own truth. That kind of man isn't reactive. He's deliberate. He chooses who to love, where to invest, when to speak. And that calm, conscious presence disarms people used to chaos. It exposes how unfree they really are. Most people don't fear your strength. They fear the fact that you've stopped seeking theirs, that you've stopped negotiating your worth, that you've stopped asking for permission to be whole. And in that moment, brother, when you realize that you are no longer moved by approval, no longer seduced by noise, no longer dependent on external cues to define your identity, you become what this world fears most: a free man. And there is nothing more powerful than that. You will be misunderstood. And not just once, but often, and by many. You will be called distant when you are simply discerning, cold when you are simply clear, arrogant when you are simply self-respecting. People will project their discomfort onto your presence, and they will label your strength as something dangerous. Let them, because their resistance isn't about you. It's about what you mirror back to them. When a man becomes whole, when he no longer seeks to be chosen, but simply to be met, he breaks the rules of emotional engagement that others rely on to feel powerful. He disrupts the performance. He no longer plays the role they expect. And for many, that is intolerable. They won't say, "You make me question myself." They'll say, "You're too much." They won't admit, "I can't manipulate you." They'll say, "You're intimidating, but don't shrink." That misunderstanding is the cost of standing in your truth. It is the echo that tells you you've left the crowd, and in doing so, you've entered your own path. The path of the individual. The path that Kierkegaard called the only road toward selfhood. Because here's the paradox. If the world fully understands you, it's likely because you're still performing for it. True clarity will always be met with resistance. True alignment will always create discomfort in those who are still hiding behind personas. And yet, you must walk anyway, not to prove a point, not to be admired, but because you cannot not walk it. You've seen too much. You've tasted too much of what's false. You've betrayed yourself before, and you won't do it again, not for comfort, not for love, not for belonging. So when they misunderstand, you let them. When they label you, let them. You do not exist to be explained. You do not exist to be pleasing. You exist to be whole. And wholeness has always been a threat to systems and people built on fragmentation. You don't need to be known by everyone. You just need to be known by yourself. Because the few who can truly see you will never forget you. And the rest? They were never meant to hold space for the man you're becoming anyway. In a world that rewards conformity, distraction, and emotional performance, the greatest act of courage is to remain true to yourself. The message is clear. You don't need to become more likable. You need to become more aligned. You don't need to chase love, approval, or applause. You need to stop betraying your own soul to fit into places that were never built to hold your depth. If you're misunderstood, don't panic. That's often the first sign you're waking up. Clarity will cost you comfort. Presence will cost you popularity. But what you gain is priceless self-respect, inner peace, and a life built on truth, not performance. So walk the path, even if it's quiet, even if it's lonely, especially then. Because in that silence, you'll meet the only person who can set you free yourself. Don't be afraid to be the man who sees clearly and walks alone. The world may fear him, but it also needs him more than ever.